Welcome to Practically Political. I'm Dave Spencer.
And I'm Carrie Sheffield. We're glad to have you here. We've got a special guest for this podcast episode, Mr. Bill Kristol. Bill, I've known for a while. He's now the editor-at-large for The Bulwark, and he's also the director of Defending Democracy Together. Bill, welcome so much to Practically Political.
Thanks, Carrie and Dave. Great to be with you.
So, Bill, I want to start things off. So we just last week hit, or roughly the last little bit, 1 year anniversary of the repeal of the Roe v. Wade ruling by the Supreme Court. Where do things stand politically? I mean, it seemed that it was a factor in the midterm elections last year, but do you think it's an issue that is, where do you think it falls in importance to voters, and how much do you think it's going to impact the 24?
I think it's hard to know because it's not that often that a 49-year-old precedent gets overturned, and one that's does affect, for better or worse, obviously, actual policies and actual choices that people make or would like to be able to make. So I think it's not like a normal court decision, not normal, but many other decisions which are a little more abstract, at least to most people, unless the number of people who could be affected by this and who have relatives who could be affected by it, and friends obviously is almost the whole country. So I think in practice it makes a lot of difference what state you live in. And clearly it affected things in 22 in states that where the Republican, and mostly this was the case, I think is the instance where it affected things the most is where the Republican Party had locked itself into, or chose to lock itself into, a very strong, let's just call it pro-life position, 6 weeks maybe, something like that. And the state was not there in terms of the majority of the state electorate. And so in a state like Michigan, it really helped the Democrats. In other states, I don't know that Democrats paid much of a price, though you could say, well, doesn't the reverse happen? What about the Democrats have their own extreme positions, 9 months, et cetera, of abortion rights? But I don't know many states where that actually rebounded against the Democrats. Now, in 2022, these were state elections. It sort of mattered who the governor of Michigan or Wisconsin was going to be. 2024, obviously, presidential level, you could argue less direct effect. You could imagine a federal law on abortion, however, one way or the other, either codifying the right or codifying a limit on the right. But assuming that doesn't look too likely, I still think in some states it could have an effect. In states where the Republican Party, in particular, is sort of out of step with, I think, the majority of voters. In states like Texas, where I thought, gee, that was a pretty draconian law that Governor Abbott signed, 6 weeks, and also remember the kind of bounty for people who testified that other people were getting abortions. That seems not to have hurt the Republicans, honestly, in 2022. Florida, I'd say, though, Ron DeSantis said he was pro-life, and I assume he really is, but the law in Florida was 15 weeks. I think now it's 6 weeks. Could that affect some people in Florida? And then I think especially in a state like Arizona and then those Midwestern states, I don't know that if the Republican presidential candidate has to run or chooses to run on a platform of a federal law that limits abortion pretty radically, or if he's even associated with a party that's done that at that state level, I think it helps the Democrats some.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really state by state, and it is kind of a patchwork. So you have the Georgia race also. So Georgia passed the 6 weeks prior to the midterm elections, and yet you had Governor Kemp, win, I believe, by 8 points, and he defeated Stacey Abrams, who tried to make that her signature issue. But then you have the split ticket, obviously, with the Senate going. So in some respects, I think that had to do with candidate quality. And then just conservative culture in Georgia, but yeah, in certain other states, what's interesting, I think, will be to watch in Florida, as you said, because they did pass that 6 weeks, and just looking at the Latino vote and how much more conservative Latinos are in Florida compared to the rest of the country. I mean, in general, they're trending more conservative, Latinos are, but in Florida, it was just like pedal to the metal, Latinos going, for Ron DeSantis. So it'll be interesting. And given, the Catholic faith and the Catholic family focus for Latinos, that I would argue that it's actually something that they want.
I don't know. I think the Latinos in Florida, though, seem to be conservative on economics. They want to they really hate socialism, given where they're from, and just given their general correct judgment often that, free market's good and that's the way to make it up in America. And they like high educational quality and all kinds of things that are associated a little more maybe with conservatives than liberals these days. I'm not sure. The polling suggests they're not that different, actually, on the abortion issue, on pro-choice versus pro-life. But but who knows? I do think one other thing I'd just say is I think a lot depends. You mentioned Georgia is a good case with Brian Kemp, but it didn't look, I think, to an average Georgia voter as it was a strict law, you might say, a restrictive law, but it didn't look extreme. It didn't look crazed. It didn't look, they weren't giving bounties to turn in people. They weren't, I think it wasn't a big deal. I don't think they were trying to prevent people perhaps from ordering things from out of state and so forth. Whereas I think in other states, it had a little more the feeling of, it's sort of a really vindictive almost attempt to punish people and to deprive people of choices. And even if you got penalized for going out of state to do something which was illegal in another state, which was legal in another state. So I think a lot depends. And we found this in the focus group Sarah Longwell did for Defending Democracy Together, for the Republican Accountability Project, that the general feeling of extremism does hurt a political party. It's hurt the Democrats on a bunch of things, true, defunding the police, et cetera, even though you could say in a very literal way, well, but that's not really quite their position, or, that this person in the state isn't for that. But there are a number of voters who just are put off by a feeling of extremism. And as you say, it is candidate dependent. And there was no, if you sound different if you're Mastriano in Pennsylvania and certainly Kemp in Georgia, and they are different. So there's a reason they sound different, even though if you could have a checklist of some of the policies, they might look rather, similar.
Well, I think as you folks are talking about on the micro level, the verdict is still out, though I think it's going to help the Democrats overall. But on the macro level, you've seen some really fundamental shifts. And again, most people say, hey, we expand rights in this country, we don't take them away. And you have to remember that most women of reproductive age have never lived in a world without Roe, which, whatever you want to say about it, and there are many pluses and cons, it was kind of an uneasy truce that Americans had accepted. And I think also, as I've said before, I think Republicans have been really, the pro-life movement they've been sore winners. They could have had 95% of what they wanted without pushing this extremism. Remember, the deal was all we want to do is just return it to the states. That's all we want to do. But now they're pushing national bans and going way more extreme than most people want. So I think you're starting to see trends in terms of, for the first time, more people are identifying as pro-choice than pro-life. That's never happened before. I think you're also seeing an inversion where it used to be that a lot of Republican voters made it mandatory that the candidate they voted for was pro-life. Now you're seeing it. The other side is pro-choice. So again, we'll see what happens in the election, but I think that the pro-life movement has misplayed their hand, and I think in the end it's going to be very detrimental, but time will tell.
No, I think the last point's a very good point. Those are all good points, but the last point's particularly good. I mean, obviously the presidential election in particular, people vote on many, many issues, and it's unlikely that this issue gets, 40% of the voters are not going to go in to the polling booth or fill out their mail-in ballot thinking I'm voting primarily on this issue. But as I said, there's a certain sense of extremism that could be conveyed by extreme policies or stances or just rhetoric on this issue, A, and B. I think your point's a very good one and it is supported by public opinion that people are put off by it's now a real political issue in a way. It used to be a symbolic issue to some degree with are you for or against Roe v. Wade. Certainly it energized pro-life voters who are unhappy with the status quo more than pro-choice voters who I think took the status quo for granted because the Supreme Court had ruled and looked like it was going to continue upholding it until just a very few years ago. Now the status quo it's up in the air in many states and to some degree at the federal level. And the data does suggest that the pro-choice, the minority, the small, relatively small number, but not tiny number of voters for whom this is a number 1 or 2 or 3 issue, probably now there are more pro-choice, such voters who are pro-choice than such voters who are pro-life. So I tend to think politically it continues to help the Democrats in the general sense of we're talking right after the Supreme Court term ended, maybe a general sense too that the court has a lot of Republican appointees on it. That's true. It's nothing nefarious or not too much nefarious about that. Maybe it was a little nefarious with Mitch McConnell and stuff, but still basically you win the presidency, you get to appoint judges. So what are there? 6 Republican appointees and 3 Democratic, but it's not even obviously. And several of these decisions at the end were 6-3. In a general sense, I should think that, the court's pretty conservative. Maybe that's a good thing. It stops some of the Democratic overreach. Like he probably didn't, President Biden probably doesn't shouldn't really have had the executive ability to forgive student loans just on his own, dubious interpretation of the legislation. But the court will fix that. If you're sort of a moderate voter, you think to yourself, the court's not going anywhere. And these 6 conservative justices don't look like they're going anywhere. And okay, so that's a bit of a check on Biden. And I do think, therefore, if you're right in the middle, you think maybe it's better not to have another Republican president who might get another appointment or two and really have a lopsided court chugging down this path even further. So I think in that respect, marginally helps probably the Democrats.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's really should be. I think, politically, the world is important to understand how the world works. But I guess for me, for someone who is pro-life, it's not about politics. It's about what's right and wrong. It's about that there's a human life at stake, and the fact that over 90% of scientists who are apolitical say that immediately at conception there's a human life at stake. And that's something that I think should not be lost in the middle of all this. And I think the Supreme Court, created this pause as a culture to say, states, this is something important to think about. And I think my hope is that the middle ground is the area of prevention. So we can talk more about prevention as opposed to termination, because so much of the focus is on termination. We get to prevention, we don't even have to get to that stage. That's my hope. And also on the national ban, Dave, just to point out, the Lindsey Graham bill would prohibit it after 15 weeks, which is the vast majority of Americans support after 15 weeks. I don't think that's extreme at all.
Well, the bottom line is,
about that. So I've been.
Go ahead.
I've been pro-life, and I am pro-life to some degree, but I've educated and learned more now when it became a live issue. And, even some of the abortions that are sought after 15 weeks are really for medical reasons. Almost most of them actually are. People don't sit around, being pregnant for 6 months and decide, hey, I think it's sort of just as a lark, I'm going to abort the baby. Maybe a few do, but a lot of times there's genuine distress, genuine risk, maybe not literally the threat of death of the mother, which is usually, a life of the mother is usually an exemption, but sometimes it's unambiguous whether it would be the life of the mother, sometimes the speed with which we can have something done. So I think it is a complicated issue. I think one can be pro-life and understand also that look, the number of abortions in this country, in part to the efforts of the pro-life movement, as well as to other things, contraception and education, declined by about a half, basically, since the high water mark in, what was that, about the mid-'80s. So I think it's interesting to see just empirically what happens with the numbers. But I also think, I think the rhetoric the pro-life movement uses is important. I think most of it has been, over the years, pretty caring and responsible, and crisis pregnancy centers and that sort of thing. I do think in the height of the victory over at Dobbs, there was a little bit of a sore winner problem, as Dave said. But we know that we'll see who the candidate is, and we'll see what different people say as we go ahead over the next year. I think it's in flux. We just don't quite know how it plays out.
Yeah, and I do think this abortion till birth, this is a bumper sticker. This is not a real policy. I don't know any woman who's had a late-term abortion because she wants to. Usually it's because of a crisis or fetus viability and all that. And again, as I said before, I do think that when you look at the policies, whether or not it's a 15-week ban that people support, the people feel that the deal was going to go to the states, and that's the way it should be. And by the way, that's the way it should be.
The Supreme Court should shoot down a national ban banning abortion, and they should shoot down any efforts by Congress to codify Roe versus Wade, because again, this is a state issue now.